In this video, we'll demonstrate how a PhoneGap application can store large amounts of static data in physical files on the file system. So this is very useful when you're building a disconnected application and you need to have a large amount of lookup data available to you while you're disconnected. So in this sample application that we're showing here, which is running on an iPad and is being reflected onto my screen, we're going to demonstrate how we can basically make an AJAX callback to the server, prepare a file of JSON data that we'd like to bring down to the mobile device, store that file in the file system, and then process that file and read it so that the data is available to the application. So let's start out now by tapping the Show Directory button over here to show the files that are currently in my directory on the iPad. So when I click the button, you can see it says no files found. So next I'm going to click this button here that says AJAX callback to prepare file, and this is going to make an AJAX callback to the Alpha server, prepare a file of JSON data which represents the data that I'd like to have available to me while I'm disconnected, and then temporarily put that file in a session file so that we can then download it to the mobile device and store it in the file system. So I'm going to go now and press this button. So there you can see I press the button, and that's going to make an AJAX callback to the server. And what I've done is in that AJAX callback I've put an alert to show what's just happened. So we've created a file and put it into session storage, and the file is called A5 session file data1.json. So next I'm going to click this button over here which is fetch file from server. So this is going to use the PhoneGap file transfer feature to go and fetch that file from the server and store it in the file system. Now recall when I clicked the Show Directory button to show what files were currently on the file system, it says no files found. So I'm going to go here and press the button, and you'll notice that there's a progress bar that shows very briefly while the file is being fetched. And so now we've gone ahead and we've fetched that file from the server. So now if I go and press this Show Directory button over here, you can see that sitting on the file system on my iPad is a file called data1.json, and it's in a folder that I specified called underbar my alpha files, and then a subdirectory called A5 session file. So now that I have this file sitting on my iPad, it no longer matters if I have a connection or not because the file is physically stored on the device. So next I'm going to go ahead here and press this button, Read File, where we're going to go ahead and read the file and show what's in that in the contents of the file. So I'm going to go there and press Read File, and you can see that what's in that file is a string of JSON data that's got two tables, Table 1 that's got 3 rows, and then it's got Table 2 that has got two rows. And so Table 1 has Field 1, Field 2, and Table 2 has Field 1, Field 2, and Field 3. So now that I've got this data sitting in a file on the file system, I can write code that's going to process that file. So in this first example here, I just simply read the file. But now in this next example, I'm going to read the file, and I'm going to populate this list control with the names of the tables in that JSON data. So I'm going to go ahead now and press this button over there, and you can see now that we've populated this list with the list of tables. So that's Table 1 and then Table 2. And now when I press on a row in the list here, we're going to populate this list dynamically with the data from Table 1. So I'm going to go ahead there and press Table 1. You can see there's the 3 rows of data. And then when I press on Table 2, I get the 2 rows of data over there. So what we've shown in this video is how we can basically make an AJAX callback to the server to prepare a file that contains the data that we'd like to store on the mobile device. Then we can go and, using the PhoneGap file transfer features, fetch that file from the server and store it in the file system, and then finally we can read the file and process the data. So let's pause now and pick this up into the next video where we'll go step by step behind the various aspects of this component. In the previous video, we demonstrated this component running as a PhoneGap application on an iPad. In this video, we're going to go through each of the individual buttons and show what actions they perform and explain the theory behind the button. So the first button is an AJAX callback to prepare a file of JSON data. So let's go over here and take a look at the definition. So here's our button, and you can see here that the button is just simply using action JavaScript to make an AJAX callback. And in the AJAX callback, we're basically calling an XBasic function called xb_getData. But you can see here that we're also specifying some additional data, and we're saying here that the additional data is _file name equals data1.json. So that means that we would like the server to create a file of JSON data and call that file data1.json. So let's go now and take a look at xb_getData. So I'm going to go now to the XBasic side over here, and here's our function xb_getData. So in this example here, we basically just hand-coded some JSON data, but of course in the real world you'd want to go to a database and do a query against the database. But in this case, you can see here that our string of JSON data is just simply an object that has two properties, table 1 and table 2, and that table 1 is an array of JSON objects, so field 1 and field 2, and table 2 is also an array. It has field 1, field 2, field 3. So this file here of JSON data represents the data that we would like to retrieve from the alpha server and store on the mobile device. So now that we have the string of JSON data, we need to actually store that in a file. So in order to store it in a file, we call the request get temp file name to get the name of a temporary file that we can use to store the data in. So this here temp fn now is going to be the name of the file where we're going to store the JSON data, and then you can see we basically call the XBasic file from string function to store this JSON data in this temporary file. So now what we need to do is take this temporary file and actually put it into session storage so that it can be downloaded to the mobile device. But you can see that we also are looking here at the file name that was passed back in the AJAX callback. So what we're saying over here is that if the file name was passed in the AJAX callback, so if there's e._file name exists, then we're going to set this variable, client-side variable, to e._file name, which, as you recall, was data1.json. Otherwise, if for some reason e._file name was not present in the callback, we're going to just basically create a random file name, and then we're going to save this file that we've created that contains the JSON data into something called a session file, and we're going to use the client-side file name as the key for the session file. So basically, session files are important here because this file over here that was created is a temporary file that will only live for the length of this request. But we're going to basically end the request, send a response back to the client, and then the client's going to initiate a download. So we need to have the file exist beyond the life of the request, and so we put it into a session file. So now that we've stored this file in a session file, we can now go and get a URL to this file by calling the format file data URL, and that's going to now give us a URL that points to this temporary session file, and then we're going to send this URL back to the client, and on the client side we're going to invoke a function called fetchFile, which is a user-defined function that we'll explain next, and pass to that file the URL that points to the JSON data. So let's pause now and pick this up in the next video. So continuing now, you can see that after the AJAX callback completes, we're going to call a function called fetchFile and pass into that function the URL. But what we're also going to do right now temporarily is store that URL in a global variable, well actually an object inside the UX component object. So we're actually going to put the URL in a variable called underbar URL to fetch. And the reason that we're going to be doing that right now is that it's going to allow us to break all of this code into smaller pieces, and so we can develop the code that fetches the files from the server independently from the code that reads the files, etc. So in the real world you might not need to do this, but for right now we're going to put that URL into this temporary variable. So now that we've got the code that makes the AJAX callback and then stores the URL inside this temporary variable, the next thing that we're going to do is move on to the next button, which is this button over here, which goes and makes another callback to the server to actually fetch the file so that it can store it in the file system. So in order to write the code for this fetch file action, we're going to use action JavaScript to actually help us do the work. So let's go now to the click event for that button, and we can see here that we're using a built-in action in action JavaScript called PhoneGap file download. So if we go here and just type in PhoneGap, we'll see that there's an action here called PhoneGap file download, and this action allows you to fetch multiple files from a remote server and store those files in the file system on the device. So let's so we've selected that option. Let's open up the editor to see how this function is defined. So the first thing you can see here is that we need to specify a JavaScript function that contains the names of the remote files that we'd like to download. So actually what we mean here when we say the names of the remote files, we actually really mean the URLs of the remote files that we'd like to download, and we need to call a JavaScript function that will return that data. So you can see we've specified a JavaScript function called getFiles, and we'll go take a look at getFiles next. Then we've specified the folder on the device where we'd like those files to be stored, and you can see here we've specified underbar my alpha files, and then we basically said force download if file is found on device. So that means that if the file has been previously downloaded and you try to download it again, if this box was unchecked, the file would not be downloaded because it's already found on the device. But if this box is checked, then we're going to always download the file even if an existing file is found. We specified that we would like to display progress while the file is being downloaded. Now in the example we showed, the file was small, so it downloaded so quickly that progress wasn't really that necessary. But you might be downloading a very large file, several megabytes in size, and in that case showing the user progress while the file is downloading would be very helpful. And then finally you can specify what JavaScript to execute once the file has been downloaded. So you can see over here basically we're just putting up an alert that says that the file was downloaded, and if there's an error we're going to just simply put up an alert that says there was an error. So let's go now take a look at this getFiles function, which is going to return the name of the URLs that point to the files that we'd like to download. So let's go over here now to our JavaScript functions and then look at getFiles, and we can see that getFiles is simply reading the URL that we put into this temporary variable and then returning it as an array. So getFiles needs to return an array of files that you'd like to download. So we just put the file that we read out of this temporary variable into an array and then return that. So let's pause now and then pick it up in the next video. So we've just discussed how the fetch files from server code is developed using action JavaScript, and now let's show how we basically created these two functions that showed the contents of that directory, deleted the directory, and then finally read the file that had been downloaded. So let's first go to the show directory button, and you can see that that was again done with action JavaScript. So from action JavaScript we chose the file system actions, and the action that we chose was get directory recursive. So that's going to basically get the directory of all get the contents of all subdirectories as well, and you can see that basically that this function basically gets passed into it an array. So if we go here and look at the, so this is the name of the directory we'd like to read, and then in the onSuccess function, you can see that the onSuccess function basically is called, and it's passed in an array that contains these properties. And the entries in this array can either be file names or they can be directory names, and there's a property called display that is just a string that contains the file name and indicates with this code here whether the entry is a file or a directory. So we're going to basically create a JavaScript, create a string called message. So we're going to loop over all of the items in the array and create this message that has the display property of the array, and we're going to put a break after that, and then we're going to set the inner HTML of a div called message1 to that message. So if we go back and look at our component, we can see that we have some static text over here that has a div called message1. So when we say show directory, we're going to basically read that array of files and then put the result in this div over here. So the delete directory again is done with action JavaScript. So if we go here and say edit action, you can see there's the remove directory action. So we're calling remove directory recursive. And then again in the onSuccess function, we're just simply writing to that div specifying that the directory was removed. And then finally the read file action again is done with action JavaScript. So you can see we're calling again the PhoneGap file system actions, and the file that we're reading is called my alpha files, underbar my alpha files, because that's the folder where we specified that we would like to download the files to. But you'll notice that that it has a prefix here called A5 session file / data1.json. So you might have expected this to just be underbar my files / data1.json, but in fact the A5 session file prefix is necessary because when we requested the URL of the session file in our Ajax callback, this is the name that we got back. So the actual file is stored in a subdirectory under my alpha files called A5 session files, and then in the onSuccess function basically there's the data that got read from the file. We're just going to put that data in the div so we can see what data was read from the file. So basically that showed us, so these three buttons show us how we can see the contents of the directory, delete the directory, and then read the file that we downloaded from the directory. So the final step is to explain how we then populated the first list, how we then populated this list over here with the names of the quote-unquote tables that were downloaded in the JSON file, and then finally when we tap on a row in this tables list, how we populate this list over here showing the actual data. So let's pause now and pick this up in the next video. So we're going to explain now how this populate button works. So this populate button needs to read the contents of the file and then populate the list with the names of all the tables in that JSON file. So let's go back now and look at this populate button over here. So there's the action. So we can see that what this button is going to do is it's going to do the PhoneGap read file. So it's going to read the file and then it's going to populate the list. So this code over here, this code to read the file, was simply copied by taking this action here, this action JavaScript, which was defined using the Genie, and then after we had defined it in the Genie, we went there and said view JavaScript, and we just copied this code to the clipboard and used that as the starting point. So let's go back now to our populate button. So we start out with the code that we copied from action JavaScript, and then in the success function over here where data is passed in. So the success function is this function over there, and then this is the failure function. So in the success function, data is passed in, but data is just a string. So we need to pass that string into a JSON, into a JavaScript object. So we call JSON.pass, passing in data. And so now underbar D is now going to be an object. Then what we do is we create an array called underbar list, and we push onto the list entries that have a property called table. So basically the first item in underbar D is going to say table 1, so this will be table colon table 1, and then the next one will be table colon table 2. So table is the name of the field in list 1. So if we go and look at list 1 over here, this first list of tables, we'll see that it's defined using static data, and it has a field called table, and then of course the layout has that field called table. So the field name of the field in the list is called table. So let's go back now to the populate over there and then look at it. So that's why this over here says table. So now that we've created this array that contains the data, we just get a pointer to that list and then we populate it. So that's all the code that was necessary to populate the first list with the list of tables. Then if we go and we look at this list over here, we can see that we've got an event on the onClick event. We're going to basically call another JavaScript function called Populate Table, and this is going to populate the second table showing the actual data. So what we do is we call the second function, Populate Table, with the name of the table. So the data, we're going to read the data out of the current row that we clicked on, and so this is going to either say table 1 or table 2, and then we're going to call this function Populate Table. And what this function is going to do is it's going to dynamically create the columns for the second list. So this list right now doesn't have any columns shown, so we're going to dynamically create the necessary columns, and then we're going to populate this list. So currently list number 1 is just simply a dummy list. You can see that it has as static data just something called dummy field, and then it has as the list layout, it just has a single column called dummy field, and we've turned the heading off by just saying NBSP. So currently there's nothing at all is shown in this list. So let's pause now and pick this up in the next video, where we'll explain how the populate table function works, which is this function that dynamically populates the columns and the data in this second list. So we're continuing with our video now, and we're going to explain how the populate table function works. And as you recall, this function populates this table here with the actual data, and it sets the columns that are in that data dynamically. So before we do that, let's go and take a look behind the scenes at how a list control defines the columns in a list. So if I go here to this simple list control over here, which is based on static data, you can see we just have some static data over here that represents first name, last name, city, and state. So this is a list that has 4 columns, and if we run the component, we see there's our 4 columns over there. But if we go into the list builder and then we click this show button over here to show the JSON settings, we can scroll down in the settings object and see how those columns are defined. So you'll see here that in the columns, in the settings object, there's a property called columns, which is actually an array, and each item in the array represents a column in the list. So the properties of each item are the header, which is the HTML for the header text, whether the column can be resized, etc. But the important thing here is this thing called template, and we can ignore most of this, but the important part here is this curly bracket first name. So that basically uses client-side templating, and it takes the data from the data object in that row, the first name property, and puts it into the template over here. And then of course we have some additional properties like the width of the column and what field will be sorted on when we click on the column header to sort. But the important part here is the template over here. So here's the next row, the next column. So this is last name, and the template there is last name, and then here's the city column, and the template there is city. So you can see that in order to dynamically populate the columns in a list, we're going to need to dynamically generate this columns object based on the data in the table that we'd like to display. So now that we understand how to dynamically set the columns in a list, let's go back to our code here and take a look at what's going on behind the scenes in this populate table function. So you can see that what we're doing in the populate table function is reading the file from the file system, and then in the onSuccess function where we get data, we're going to pass the data into a JavaScript object. So now we have underbar D, which is an object. But now we would like to read out from this object the data for the particular table we'd like to populate. So here you can see we're passing in table. So underbar D is an object that contains all of the tables, and then underbar DT over here, which is underbar D and then square bracket table, reads out from this object, from the underbar D object, just the data for this particular table. So now underbar DT is going to be an array, and what we're going to do now is print out a message that says rows in table, and this is the name of the table, and this is the number of rows in that table. So this just simply puts a message above the list saying how many rows are in the table. And then we're saying that if there are more than 0 rows in the table, we're going to create an array here called definition, and this is the column definitions that we're going to use to populate that list. So we're going to loop over all of the columns, all of the properties in the first row of the array that contains the data. So this is going to basically have in it, for example, field 1, field 2, field 3, and then since there could be a lot of fields, we're going to say we're going to stop when we get to 5 fields. So we're only going to display the first 5 columns in the data, and then here we're going to basically push onto this definition array basically these properties: the header, which is this is the column name that will appear in the title, and then the template, and then you can see here's the curly bracket for the template, and then the name of the field. So this is the template, and then this basically represents the definition for one column, but we have an array of that, so we're going to push those onto the array, and then once we've got that array, we're going to get a pointer to the list, and then we're going to set the list's columns property. So we're continuing with our video now discussing how the populate table function works. So now that we have this definition that defines all of the columns that we'd like to see in our list, we set the list's layouts.default.columns property to underbar def. We call the refresh function, which basically redraws the list control using these columns, and then finally we populate the list with underbar DT, which is the array of data for the particular table. So you can see there's underbar DT, which is the array of data for that table. So this is the code here that is used to actually populate the second list with the data. So we've now explained basically how all of these individual pieces work. This is the AJAX callback to prepare the JSON file. This is the second callback to go and fetch the files from the server and put them in the file system. And then this is the function that reads the data from the files, from the file system, and then populates this list over here. And then we've shown how once you have the list of tables in this list, you can click on a row and then populate this list over here. So now in the next step, we're going to show how you can basically take all of these steps that were done individually and put them into a single button, so that when I press this button over here, we make the callback, initiate the file download, and also populate the tables, all in a single step. And also to make the demonstration more interesting, instead of basically populating the JSON with this simple predefined list of JSON data over here, instead what we're going to do is we're going to we're going to call this function over here called get northwind, and what this function is going to do is it's going to basically make queries against the sample northwind database and create a JSON file that contains the data for every single table in the northwind database. So the XBasic for this function over here is actually fairly simple. So let's go and take a look at it. So if we go look at the get northwinds function, the first thing you can see is we're opening a connection to the sample northwind database, which is in the MDB files folder where you installed Alpha Anywhere. So this just gets a pointer to the sample file. Then we open that connection. We call the list tables function to get a list of all the tables in the Northwind database, and then we loop over each table and we execute a select statement. So this is going to be select star from, say, customers or orders or order header, order details, products, etc. And then once we execute that SQL, we then call the JSON object syntax, result set to JSON object syntax, to get a JSON representation of the data. It's not really a pure JSON representation, it's just basically a CRLF delimited list of JSON objects. So we need to put a comma after each line and then make it into an array by putting a leading square bracket and trailing square bracket on it, and then we basically make it an entry in an array so that it looks like this, basically table name, which would be, say, customers, and then the data, and then the next would be, say, employees, and then the data. So basically we can carry on over here, and you can see that once we've done all that, we just simply return the value. So this returned value here looks very much like this in format, excepting that it's basically got an entry for every single table in the Northwinds table. So let's pause now and pick this up in the next video. So we're discussing now how this button that makes the Ajax callback can do all of the work. Make the callback and then initiate the download of the file to the mobile device and then populate the list. So let's go back now to our function that makes the Ajax callback. You can see now we're going to replace the function that generates the JSON with the call to get all of the data from Northwind. And then at the end of the function, you can see that we're going to go here and we're going to change it from calling fetch files to instead calling fetch files to. So now let's go and see what fetch files to does. So fetch files to is the function that's going to be called after the callback completes. So let's go back to our JavaScript here and look at fetch files to. So you can see what we've done in fetch files to is we've taken the code from this action over here. We've taken the code from the fetch files from server. We've gone here and we've said view JavaScript, and then we've just copied this code to the clipboard. And then we've taken that code from the clipboard and we've pasted it into fetch files 2, excepting that when we pasted it in, we no longer need to call the get files the get files function, because we already have passed in the URL there. We just simply need to put that URL into an array with a property called file name as the object name, and then we go ahead and we call the PhoneGap file download function, passing in this list of options. And then in the onComplete function, we're going to call this function here called read files, and read files was created by simply basically taking the code that we executed for the read file action, and we just simply wrapped it in a JavaScript function over here. And now we have this single function that basically will initiate the download to the server, initiate the download of the file from the server to the mobile device, and then go ahead and process the file. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead now and look at this in action on the mobile device. So I'll pause now and pick this up in the next video. So we're now back looking at my iPad, and we're going to show now how the button that does the AJAX callback can do all of the actions like download the file, etc., and then process the file. So let's start out by making sure that there's nothing in the file system. So we'll click the delete directory button. So now the directory was removed, and if we go and click the show directory button, we see that there's no files found. So now we're going to go ahead here and click the AJAX callback button. So this is going to prepare the file of all the data from the Northwinds table, then download it to the server, to the mobile device, and then populate this table over here all in one step. So I'm going to go ahead now and tap this button. So you see now that basically the file got downloaded, and it was about a megabyte file, but it didn't take very long to download. It's populated this list over here of all the tables from the Northwind database, and if I click on an individual row here, you can see that this second list is populated. So there were 8 rows in the categories table. The customers table has 91 rows. The employee table has 9 rows. The order details table has 2,000 rows. Orders has 830 rows. Products has 77. And shippers has 3. And then finally suppliers has 29. So what we've done is we've downloaded the entire Northwinds database, put it into a file of JSON data in the file system on the mobile device, and this data is now all going to be available to us even if we don't have a connection, but it's not using up any space in local storage. So the techniques that we've discussed in this series of videos show how you can bring large amounts of data onto your mobile device and have them available to you while you're disconnected. Thanks very much for watching.